Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today, we are completely dismantling the old definition of resilience. For decades, society has viewed resilience as a mysterious quality of character, a sort of stoic grit possessed by the lucky few who could weather life's storms without breaking. We treated it as a moral virtue, measured it with questionnaires, and philosophers debated its origins. But in the quiet hum of MRI machines and the intricate glow of fluorescent microscopy, a very different story has emerged. Resilience is not a vague virtue. It is a tangible biological mechanism. It is a specific set of neural circuits firing in synchronized harmony, a cascade of molecular brakes and accelerators, and a dynamic interplay between our neurons, our immune system, and even the bacteria in our gut. To understand resilience is to witness the brain's most elegant magic trick, which is the ability to transmute the lead of trauma into the gold of adaptation. Crucially, resilience is not the absence of a stress response. It is not about being numb. It is the active, energy-intensive capacity to engage specific biological systems that counteract stress. This is the new science of the unbreakable brain. Let us begin with the hardware, the architecture of grit. For years, the prevailing dogma was that resilience was simply the lack of vulnerability. If you did not get depressed after a tragedy, your brain was just tough. We now know this is fundamentally wrong. Resilience is not passive. It is an aggressive, active process. At the heart of the resilient brain lies a constant tug-of-war between two ancient adversaries, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The amygdala is the brain's smoke detector. In vulnerable individuals, this detector is set to hypersensitive. A harsh word from a boss or a sudden financial setback triggers a 4-alarm fire, flooding the body with cortisol. In resilient brains, the amygdala still activates because resilient people are not fearless, but it is swiftly and efficiently modulated by the prefrontal cortex, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex. Think of the medial prefrontal cortex as the CEO of the brain. In resilient individuals, the neural highways connecting the CEO to the smoke detector are thicker, faster, and more robust. This structural integrity allows the CEO to send a swift stand-down order to the amygdala, reinterpreting the threat as a manageable challenge. This is known as top-down regulation. Perhaps the most groundbreaking discovery in recent years is the identification of distinct neural circuits for active versus passive coping. When a mouse or a human faces a threat, it can freeze, which is passive, or it can fight or escape, which is active. These behaviors are hardwired into the periaqueductal gray, or PAG, a primal region in the brainstem. Research shows that active coping is driven by a specific circuit running from the caudal medial prefrontal cortex to the dorsolateral PAG. When this circuit fires, it suppresses the freeze response and initiates goal-directed behavior. It turns the feeling of helplessness into the feeling of agency. Conversely, passive coping, or learned helplessness, engages a different circuit connecting the rostral medial prefrontal cortex to the ventrolateral PAG. Resilience, therefore, is biologically defined by the dominance of the caudal dorsolateral circuit. It is the neural signature of agency. But resilience also requires fuel. To keep going when things are bleak, the brain must maintain the ability to experience pleasure and anticipate reward. This is the domain of the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. In depression, this reward circuit goes dark, a state called anhedonia. In resilient brains, these regions remain responsive. But there is a twist. It is not just about having more dopamine. It is about protecting these neurons from being overwhelmed by stress. This brings us to the molecular machinery. If we zoom in from brain regions to the level of individual cells, we find a microscopic world teeming with machinery designed to protect us. In 2016, a landmark study identified a mechanism that revolutionized our understanding of resilience. Researchers found that in the VTA, the reward center, chronic stress usually causes neurons to become hyperactive, firing wildly until they burn out, leading to depressive symptoms. Resilient brains, however, deploy a secret weapon called KCNQ channels. These are potassium channels that act like molecular brakes. When stress hits, resilient brains upregulate these channels in the VTA, effectively calming the neurons and preventing the hyperactivity that leads to burnout. This is an active homeostatic mechanism, the brain working hard to stay stable. Drugs that open these channels, like retigabine, are now being investigated as a completely new class of antidepressants that work by mimicking this natural resilience mechanism. You also cannot talk about resilience without mentioning brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. Think of BDNF as the brain's fertilizer. Stress is neurotoxic. High levels of cortisol can literally shrivel neurons in the hippocampus, the memory center. BDNF is the antidote. It promotes the growth of new neurons, known as neurogenesis, and strengthens existing synapses. Resilient individuals tend to have higher baseline levels of BDNF, or can mobilize it more quickly in response to stress. It is what allows the brain to not just survive trauma, but to learn from it and rewire itself, a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. There is also a neuropeptide orchestra at play. Neuropeptide Y, often called the anti-stress molecule, is found in higher levels in special forces soldiers who perform better under extreme interrogation stress. It inhibits the release of norepinephrine, keeping the fight-or-flight response from spiraling out of control. Then there are endocannabinoids, our body's natural marijuana-like compounds. They act as a buffer at the synapse, dampening incoming stress signals and helping us unlearn fear. Now, let us look at the unsung heroes, the glia and the immune system. For a long time, neuroscientists ignored the immune system. The brain was thought to be privileged, cut off from the body's messy inflammation. We now know this is a myth, and a dangerous one for resilience. Microglia are the brain's resident immune cells. Normally, they are gentle gardeners, pruning unnecessary synapses to keep brain circuits efficient. But under chronic stress, they can transform into activated monsters. In vulnerable brains, stress primes these microglia to become inflammatory. They start pumping out cytokines like IL-1 beta and TNF-alpha, which block the production of BDNF and eat away at the synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex. This is neuroinflammation. In resilient brains, however, microglia remain in a surveillance state or express protective markers. They refuse to panic. This suggests that resilience is partly an immunological trait, the ability of your brain's immune cells to ignore false alarms. Resilience is also often built while you are unconscious. In 2012, science discovered the glymphatic system, a plumbing network in the brain dependent on aquaporin 4 water channels. During deep sleep, the brain cells literally shrink by up to 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to wash through the tissue and clear out metabolic waste products like amyloid beta and tau. But crucially, it also clears out the molecular debris of stress. Sleep deprivation jams this system. Without the nightly rinse, toxic byproducts accumulate, keeping the amygdala reactive and the prefrontal cortex sluggish. The correlation is stark. Disrupted sleep is one of the most reliable predictors of PTSD after a trauma. A resilient brain is a well-rested, well-flushed brain. We must also consider that we are not just a brain in a vat, we are a brain in a body. The vagus nerve is the superhighway connecting the two, and it is a critical component of resilience. High vagal tone, measured by heart rate variability, is a biomarker of resilience. It means your parasympathetic nervous system can quickly snap you back to rest and digest after a stressful event. Interestingly, your gut bacteria are driving this bus. The microbiome produces short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate when you eat fiber. These acids can stimulate the vagus nerve, and even cross the blood-brain barrier to inhibit histone deacetylases, effectively epigenetically priming the brain for resilience. A diversity of gut bacteria correlates with a diversity of coping strategies. It is also important to note that one size does not fit all. The machinery of resilience is not identical in men and women. Resilience in females often involves different receptor trafficking. For instance, in the locus coeruleus, the brain's adrenaline center, stress causes CRF receptors to signal differently than in males. Estrogen can be neuroprotective, enhancing BDNF, but it can also increase sensitivity to stress in certain phases of the cycle. Resilience mechanisms in males often rely more heavily on receptor internalization, hiding the receptors inside the cells so they cannot be activated. Understanding these nuances is the future of precision psychiatry. Finally, let us discuss how to engineer resilience. The most hopeful message from neurobiology is that resilience is neuroplastic. It can be learned, practiced, and strengthened through specific interventions. First, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This is not just talking. Neuroimaging studies show that successful CBT literally rewires the brain. It strengthens the frontoparietal control network and increases the structural volume of the hippocampus. It trains the prefrontal cortex to exert better top-down control over the amygdala. Then, there is mindfulness and meditation. These practices target the default mode network, the brain circuit responsible for mind wandering and rumination. In depression, this network is hyperactive. Mindfulness decouples the default mode network from the emotional centers, reducing the sticky nature of negative thoughts. Physical exercise is perhaps the single most potent polypill for resilience. It is not just about endorphins. Exercise forces the muscles to release lactate, which travels to the brain and stimulates the release of BDNF. It also increases vascular endothelial growth factor, building new capillaries to feed the brain. It trains the HPA axis to be less reactive. Social connection is also biological. We are an obligate social species. Interbrain synchrony, where the neural oscillations of two people sync up during connection, activates the anterior cingulate cortex and releases oxytocin. This social buffering directly dampens the amygdala's alarm response. And for the future of technology, there is vagus nerve stimulation. New transcutaneous devices can artificially stimulate the vagus nerve through the ear, forcing the brain into a parasympathetic state and reducing systemic inflammation. In conclusion, resilience is not magic, it is a biological feat of engineering. It is the caudal medial prefrontal cortex overriding the PAG. It is KCNQ channels opening in the VTA. It is microglia staying calm in the face of a cytokine storm. By understanding these mechanisms, we move from judging ourselves for our vulnerability to empowering ourselves with the tools to build a brain that bends but does not break. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online.